Good evening, everyone. This week's Parsha is Parshas Nasso, Tavshin Pei. They are learning be a merit for Shalema for all those who need healing, and may it be a merit for us to continue to be able to come back to shul, to continue coming back to shul, more people coming back to shul, and that Hashem should take us out of this very difficult situation with the COVID-19 virus. Okay, so what I want to do tonight is share with you an item. It's a bit of an esoteric item. It deals with something that we're not that familiar with, not something that we're practicing so much, but we hear a lot about it. And from my, preparing for this year, came upon a very interesting idea about a very interesting concept that relates to that esoteric concept itself. And that is what we call tuma. Tuma, we translate as ritual impurity. And certain things convey tuma. A dead body conveys impurity. Certain dead rodents convey impurity. Certain emissions from the body convey impurity. And that plays a very prominent role in this week's Parsha. Because in this week's Parsha, we have Perek Hey, Pasuk Aleph, chapter 5, verse 1. Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Leimar. Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, Tzavas b'nei Yisrael, command the Jewish people, Lishalchum min ha'machane, they shall send out from the camp, Kol tzarua v'chol zav. Anyone that has saras, or anyone that's a zav, v'chol tamei l'nafesh, or anyone that has become impure from coming into contact with a soul, which means with a dead body. We're talking about, we have three examples of people who are tamei, ritually impure. We have the tsarua. Tsarua means a person who is stricken with saras. Saras is something we had a while ago. It is a disease, a skin disease, where the skin develops these white spots, different types of white spots with other different colors possibly in it. And if it's confirmed that this spot is the disease or plague of saras, the person becomes impure. Saras is loosely translated as leprosy, but according to most opinions, it's not actually leprosy, but it's leprosy-like because it's a skin disease, a white skin disease. But a person who has sarua means a person with saras. That person is tamei. A zav is a person that has a certain emission from the body that makes the person tamei, impure. V'chol tamei l'nefesh means coming into contact with a dead body. A dead body is a source of impurity. And the Torah says, Hashem told Moshe that anyone that has any of one of these three impurities must be sent out from the camp. Now we'll explain what that means soon. Let's just read the next verse. Mizachra ad nekeva tishalechu. Whether it be a man or a woman, they shall be sent out. And mechutz lamachna tishalchum, they shall be sent out to outside of the camp. They shall be sent. Lo yitamu es machanehem, they shall not impurify their camps. Asher nishachem b'seicham, that I dwell in their midst. So if you have any of these three types of impurity, you're sent out from the camp, so that you do not impurify the camp, Hashem says, in which I dwell in your midst. There's some kind of contradiction. There's some kind of a tension between the fact that Hashem dwells in our camp and those people who are impure. And even though those people are not impure due to any of their own doings, at the end of the day, they are impure, and therefore they have to be sent out from the camp. So Rashi explains that when the Jews were in the desert, which is where this is taking place, there were three camps. You had the Machane Shechina, the camp of the divine presence. That meant the area where the tabernacle was and its courtyard that was surrounded by curtains. That was one camp. That was the Machane Shechina, the camp of the divine presence, the camp where the tabernacle, the Mishkan, was. We know that around the tabernacle, you had the Shevet Levi, the tribe of Levi. The Levites were encamped. Their camp was called the Machane Leviah, the camp of the Levites. And then, outside of that camp, towards the end of where the rest of the Jewish people dwelt, in all four directions, was called Machne Yisrael, the Israelite camp. These are the three camps. And depending on what level of impurity you have, you would not be permitted to remain in that camp. So Rashi tells us, Hatsarua, if a person has saras, the first one mentioned, nishtala chutz l'kula, he may not remain in any camp, not even the camp of the Israelites. He has to be outside. He's basically, so to speak, exiled out of the camp of the Jewish people. And there was a place for such people outside of the camp. And this is where the tsarua has to go. Can't be in any of the three camps. Hazav, a person who has the impurity due to this specific type of emission from his body. He's allowed to remain in the Israelite camp. He's allowed to be in the Israelite camp, but he may not be in the Machne Leviim, in the Levite camp, or in the Machne Shechina, or in the camp of the divine presence, or in the area in the domain of the Mishkan. The Tamei Lo Nefesh, and someone who is impure from a dead body, Mutar Af B'Shel Leviyah. He is allowed to be even in the camp of the Levites. Ve'ena Meshulach Ela Mishel Shechina. He only may not remain. He's only sent out from the camp of the Shechina. So depending on, so the Torah says, Mishal from Machane, send them out from the camp. Actually, they're not all sent out from the same camp. Depending on what your impurity is, that will determine which camp you may be in, which camp you may not be in, and maybe you may not be able to be in any of the camps. Okay, but that is the mitzvah here. And the Sefer HaChinuch is where now I want to share with you what he writes about this mitzvah. And the Sefer HaChinuch tells us that in a more contemporary form, if you want to know what was the Machne Shechina, the camp of the divine presence, was in the desert, the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and its courtyard. Later on, when the Beis HaMikdash was built, the Beis HaMikdash and its courtyard was the Machne Shechina. And therefore, whoever was not permitted the Machne Shechina, which was all of them, any one of these three people, the Tzarua, the Zav, the person coming from a dead body, none of them were allowed to be in the Machne Shechina, the camp of the divine presence. None of them were permitted to be in the Beis HaMikdash. And so that's the first thing the Sefer HaChinuch says, is that what was the Machne Shechina in the desert, which was the tabernacle and its courtyard, then when the Beis HaMikdash was built, was the Beis HaMikdash in its courtyard. Okay. Now, the Sefer HaChinuch also points out that when we read these verses that talk about that they have to be sent out, it mentions it many times. It says, command the Jewish people and to send out from the camp all these people. From male, or whether it be male or female, send them outside the camp, they shall be sent. It mentions sending a number of times. Why does it mention it so many times? So Sefer HaChinuch says that it is somewhat of an indication, he calls it somewhat of an indication, of the severity of what we're talking about. Because just as a person who wants to warn you about something doesn't just warn you once, they'll warn you a couple of times. Don't go there, stay away from there. When something is serious and you don't want a person to get themselves into any kind of problems or trouble, you're not going to say it once, you're going to warn them a number of times. So if the Rebbeinu Shalom warns us a number of times, send them out, then that means this is something important, something serious, that Hashem wants to keep letting us know, you need to do this, you need to send this out. And then the Sefer HaChinuch then kind of asks a question on himself. If the fact that we repeat things is a sign of its severity, well, we also know some very serious laws of the Torah that aren't even explicitly mentioned in the Torah. They're derived. They're derived from words in the Torah. They're not explicit at all. So what is it? Is it, if you're telling me that mentioning it a lot of times, it means that's a sign of severity? Well, what about the serious things that we know that aren't even mentioned explicitly in the Torah? So he says it's not a contradiction. Everything has its proper place. Hashem has his reason as to why one law is expressed in one way, one law is expressed in a different way. But it's not a contradiction. It's not a question to say that repeating something many times can be a sign of seriousness involved, even though there are serious things that aren't even mentioned at all. So that's what he says in his first paragraph on this mitzvah. That again, what applies in more contemporary times, again, it's not that relevant to us, but what was in more contemporary situation after the desert, the Machne Shechina, the camp of the divine presence was the Beis Hamikdash in its courtyard. And the fact that the Torah has mentioned so many times, send them out, is a sign of the seriousness of the matter. Okay. Then the Sefer HaChinuch goes in to explain this whole idea of why do these people have to be sent out? And it would seem to be why the Torah says send them out because I dwell there, Hashem says. How are we supposed to understand what is the problem here between the person who's tamei and they are being in the presence of where Hashem's presence rests? So the Sefer HaChinuch writes like this: when it comes to this matter of impurity, it was known to the sages. Tuma weakens the intellect, or let's use if I take the words of the Sefer HaChinuch literally, the power of the intellectual soul, the nefesh hasichlis, the soul of intellect. Tuma weakens that intellect. The arbe vaisa, and it mixes it up, it confuses it. And it separates between the intellect of the person, and what he calls the pure and perfect elevated understanding. I'm not sure exactly what that means, what this pure and perfect elevated understanding. Is that a reference to an aspect of Hashem? Is it just some kind of spiritual level? But whatever it is, it's some kind of a spiritual level that relates to our intellect. And we want our intellect to connect to that higher form of intellect. And when a person becomes tamei, whether it be tsaras, or whether it be zav, or whether it be a dead body, a person now contracts tuma from that source. That is now going to, as the wording of the Sefer HaChinuch says, weaken the power of the intellect, confuse it, and separate between it and the higher, pure, elevated understanding. Now, what my understanding of this is that it doesn't mean that when you're tamei, does that mean that if I'm tamei, my intellect doesn't work well in the sense of math, in the sense of science? When the Sefer HaChinuch says it weakens the power of the intellect, my understanding is it means the power in the intellect to grasp spiritual concepts. We know that when it comes to understanding Torah and understanding the depth of Torah and delving into the depths of Torah, and all the more so when we're talking about Kabbalistic concepts, heavenly concepts, you need your intellect, you need a special intellect for that. You need to be blessed with a certain intellect to be able, that our human intellect should be able to delve and comprehend these concepts. Doesn't work the same way it works with comprehending secular concepts. Concepts of Torah in its greatest form of understanding is something that our intellect has to be pure. It has to be sanctified. It has to be conditioned to be able to grasp these concepts in the proper way. So our intellect has to have a certain level of purity to be able to clarity, to be able to grasp these concepts. And Tuma takes that away. Tuma, as he says, weakens our power to do that. The power of our intellect to grasp Torah, spiritual concepts, is weakened when we are tamei. Tamei is tuma, what we call ritual impurity, is not just a practice. It's something that's real. It's real in the spiritual realm. In the spiritual realm, which is also a real realm, a realm that's even more real than our physical realm, Tuma exists in that. It exists within our spiritual realm. We exist within a spiritual realm. And in that spiritual realm, when Tuma enters that, and we call that impurity, what that means is at least one dimension of what that means is that it weakens and blurs our intellect to be able to grasp and delve into spiritual concepts. And as he says, it separates between our intellect and this higher, the seichel yoni, this higher elevated form of understanding, as they translate it here. All this is all part of not regular intellect. It's part of our intellect's ability to grasp spiritual concepts. For that, it needs a certain kind of spiritual clarity, and it needs to be able to connect with that higher form of understanding. And when a person is impure, a person loses that. A person is weakened with that. And it says it weakens the power, it confuses it, and separates between it and the higher understanding. And the Chetzer continues, and it's going to remain separated until the person purifies himself. Now, so now that's it's going to remain until a person purifies himself. Now, the source that the Sefer Chinuch brings a source for this concept of this weakening of the intellect. As we find what is written regarding this is a verse that talks about non-kosher animals. We know that non-kosher animals are also referred to as a behemoth tameya, an impure animal. And the pasuk and the Sefer Chinuch cites a verse in the book of Vayikra, which is talking about, that verse specifically is talking about eating what we call shkatzim or ramasim, like creeping animals. The pasuk says, do not eat them, so that you do not become impurified through them. And you will become impurified by them, meaning if you eat by them. There's extra words here clearly. It says, you shall not become impurified from them. And you will become impurified in them if you do partake. Meaning, do not partake so as not to purify yourselves. And you will purify yourselves if you do partake of them. Now, this second word, is clearly extra. The Darshu and Zachrenim Levracha, our sages interpret this word as coming to teach us a different concept. Don't read the word Vinit Mesem, which means you shall become impure, but rather Vinitamtembam, you shall become closed up. When you partake of these animals, you become closed up. Kolaimar, meaning Shemayanais Haseichel, the well springs of the intellect, Nitamtemim B'Tumeya, become closed up through this impure animal, this impure thing that you are partaking of. This is a very important concept. The Sefer Chinuch is telling us the source of this whole idea of this closing up, this weakening of the intellect that comes about through tuma, what we call ritual impurity. The source of that is actually the impurity that's mentioned by non-kosher animals. By non-kosher animals, it says v'tamtem, you will be closed up. Now, if a person were to eat a non-kosher animal, it doesn't make them necessarily. It's possible that they won't become ritually impure because they ate a dead animal. Now, not necessarily going to make you a dead animal. Not every dead animal is going to make you impure, and therefore, it's possible you can actually eat these animals, right? Accidentally, let's say, and you don't become tummy impure to say that I can't go to the base of Mikdash. Nonetheless, the source of this concept, that where we find the word tumah, that means that this will cause us our minds to be closed up to spiritual concepts. The source of that is the non-kosher animal. In a higher level, in a greater level, it applies to these people that we call tamei ritually impure. The person with saras, the person who's a zav, the person coming into contact with a dead body. But what we have is just a very, again, it's an esoteric idea. It's not a typical, regular concepts that we understand our regular worldly concepts. But it's a very interesting insight to what ritual impurity does. not only ritual impurity, anything that's called impure, like a non-kosher animal, that's what it does. It closes up our intellect. It desensitizes our intellect to spiritual concepts, to spiritual matters. Then he continues. Now we can explain, why is this a problem? Why do these things create a problem of being in the Beis HaMikdash? Therefore, in the holy and pure place, Ashuach Elokim Sham, where the Spirit of God dwells, it is not appropriate for the person who is sullied, who is dirtied with tumah, with this ritual impurity. This ritual impurity that desensitizes the mind is something that we should see as it's like a dirt. It's like you've been sullied, you've been dirtied. And therefore, he says we compare this to the palace of a king. If there is something physically about you that you're dirty, right? You fell into mud, you're full of mud, your clothing is full of mud, and now you want to stand before the king. You can't stand before the king. It's inappropriate. It's inappropriate in the presence, in the grand presence of a king, in the splendid presence of a king. How can you can't be standing there all full of dirt? It's not appropriate. Well, that's the same idea when a person is tamei. When a person is tamei, he has been dirtied. He has been spiritually dirtied. His seichel, of his intellect, is now desensitized. It's closed up. It's weakened. It's been separated from the higher understanding. That's dirt. That's spiritual dirt. And if that's spiritual dirt, it's not appropriate to stand with that kind of spiritual dirt in the Beis HaMikdash, in Hashem's presence. And Hashem's holy and pure presence, which is the place where your intellect should be able to be grasping and internalizing, comprehending all the great spiritual experiences that you have when you're in Hashem's presence, the Beis HaMikdash. If you can't do that, if the dirt is in the way of that, then you can't be in the presence of Hashem. This is dirt. It's dirt in the sense, it's a spiritual dirt in the sense of the fact that we say it clogs up the mind. And I think even more so in the fact of, in regard to the present in the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash is the place where you're supposed to be internalizing and basking and comprehending and growing in your intellect and your sensitivity and your understanding of spirituality and of God. And if now you're in a state where you're weakened from that, then it's not appropriate for you to be here. And therefore the Torah forbids these people to be in the Beis HaMikdash. So I found this very, very interesting, just understanding, this concept. This chinuch is explaining to us why a person who's tamei can't be in the Beis HaMikdash. Why? And as we just said, because he's dirty. And the whole idea of what tumah does to a person, and when, at least in one dimension, what tumah does to a person. It affects their intellect. It affects their intellect. It sensitizes their intellect to spiritual matters. And not only does that exist by these forms of impurity that you can't be in the Beis HaMikdash for, but to some degree it's also going to exist even by a non-kosher animal. It's called tamei. It's called impure. And the Torah, it's there where the Torah says that this kind of impurity, partaking of this kind of purity, closes you up. That is the negative effect that comes from partaking from something that's not kosher. Okay, so that's the first thing that I wanted to mention tonight. And the next thing I want to mention is that after the Torah talks about this mitzvah of sending these people out from the camp, then the Torah tells us right after that comes the next mitzvah. Vayidaber Hashem l'Moshe le'amar, Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, Daber b'nei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel, ish or isha, man or a woman, ki yasim mikol chatei sa'adam, who do a sin that a person could possibly commit, limomal ba'Hashem, to commit treachery against God, v'ashma ha'nefesh hahi, and that soul will be found guilty. What are we talking about here? What kind of sin are we talking about here? What's this treachery? So Rashi tells us that this is talking about a person who was withholding money from someone else that person deserved, and the person wrongfully was holding on to the money, and he swore to the fact that he doesn't have the money, that he doesn't have to give him back the money. He swore to it. V'ashma, and then he was found guilty. So that's the case here. A person was holding on to money that didn't belong to him, swore falsely regarding that matter to say he does not obligated to give the money, and then he's found guilty. How is he found guilty? They shall confess the sin that they committed. The person confesses, he swore falsely. So what's the result of that? You now must return, he must now pay back his guilt with the principal. I mean, he has to pay for his act that brings this guilt upon him. At its head, meaning the principal value of what he lied about. And you have to add another fifth. That's like a penalty the Torah gives. And he gives that to the person that he committed this treachery against. The person who he is guilty to. That is who he gives it to. Not only that, actually, this mitzvah, this is really a repeat. In the beginning, in Parshas Vayikra, this was also mentioned. And not only does the person have to pay the principal and add the fifth, but that person also has to bring a sacrifice, a carbon asham, a guilt offering, for the fact that he went ahead and he swore falsely to an obligation to give someone back their money. And what's also interesting about this case is that in this case, depending on what you could afford, that will make a difference as to what your sacrifice is going to be. What your carbon asham or guilt offering is going to be, in this case, will depend on what you can afford. If you can afford a cow, it's a cow. If you can only afford sheep, it's sheep. Birds. Not even birds, just flour to bring a meal offering, you bring a meal offering. That happens to be something else that's happening in this case. The Torah is not mentioning the carbon here, and it's only mentioning the payments. Now, the pasuk begins, this pasuk Zion that we read said, "V'hisvadu es chatasam," they shall confess their sin. So Rashi says that the only time you have to actually add a fifth to the principle of what you have to give back is only when you admit it. Interestingly, if witnesses come and testify against you, and based on their testimony, you're obligated to return what you held wrongfully. You're not going to have to bring. I mean, you didn't swear, so you don't have to bring the sacrifice. Not only that, you don't have the punishment of the fifth. But you don't have the punishment of the fifth. I think in the case of the witnesses, I think you'd still bring the sacrifice. But Rashi does tell us when it comes to the addition of the fifth, that doesn't happen when witnesses, only when you admit. Okay. The commentaries point out that the pasuk begins with the plural form. V'hisvadu es chatasam. They shall confess their sin, asher asu, that they committed. And then it switches over to singular form. V'heshivas ashamai b'roishai. And he shall return his guilt by its principle. He shall add a fifth, and he shall give it to the person that he was guilty towards. So the pasuk begins in plural form and switches over to singular form. Why is that? So the commentary of Ibn Ezra explains that v'hisvadu, they shall confess, means to say, whether it be a man, whether it be a woman, they shall confess. And then each one, whether it's the man or the woman, will now return the principle. So according to Ibn Ezra, we started off with a plural form because we want to allude to the idea this applies to both a man and a woman. And then it just goes into the singular form because it's going to be one person that's going to be bringing it. But v'hisvadu is meant to include the idea that it's a man or a woman, and v'hisvadu, whether it be a man or a woman, they shall confess, and then each one, whoever it may be, is going to go ahead and have to pay back. That is the Ibn Ezra's explanation. There is an explanation given by a work called Meloha Omer that explains in the following way. The Talmud in Tractate Bava Metzia teaches us that if, let's say, you give an object to someone else to guard for you, and you come back and you say to the person, okay, give me back what I deposited by you. And the person says, you never gave it to me. So clearly, the person's a thief. I mean, worthless. He's robbing you. The thing is, though, that, and what's going to happen then? You're going to bring him to the Beis Din. You're going to obligate him to swear. And in this case, he swore falsely. And then at the end, he admitted. And we have all what the Parsha tells us. But the Gemara says the problem is that you, the person who deposited the money by this person, you actually, to a degree, are guilty of what the Torah says, before a blind person, don't put a stumbling block. Before a blind person, don't put a stumbling block is where the Torah tells us, don't cause someone else to sin. Blind isn't literal in the sense it's only a prohibition by someone who's blind. It includes the idea of causing someone else to sin. So, for instance, in this week's Parsha, we have the law of a Nazir. A person makes a vow not to drink wine. And you go over to a Nazir and you say, here, take this cup of wine. And you give it to him. You brought him, you gave him the opportunity to sin. And then he drinks it. You transgressed. Do not cause the evil. Don't cause a person to stumble. Don't cause a person to sin. So the Gemara says that if you go ahead and you gave this person, you deposited something by this person, there was something missing. If this person was able to deny it, and it even came to a point of swearing to it, there was something missing to begin with. There was something you could have done to prevent this whole thing. You could have had witnesses. When you gave it to this person, you should have brought two witnesses to observe. I give this to that person. So that once that person would have denied, you call the witnesses, you go to the court of law, the witnesses would have testified, and Hashem's name would have never been taken in vain. And this person never would have done the terrible sin of swearing at Hashem's name in vain. And it all happened, why? Because you did not bring witnesses. You therefore have transgressed, at least to some degree, in front of a blind person. Don't put a stumbling block. You have caused them to stumble. This is a fascinating idea. I mean, he's the one who stole it. He's the one who stole falsely. You're putting the blame on me? Well, I'm not putting the blame on you totally. Of course, he's responsible. He's not allowed to steal. He's allowed to swear falsely. And you see the ramifications of that. But you, the depositor, have responsibility too. Because why you create the situation for him, why did you allow this situation to be created that now created the potential for him to do this? You shouldn't have allowed, you should not have created that potential. And therefore the Malach HaOmer says that when the Pasuk says, V'hisvadu, when they shall confess, who's the they? Number one, it means the person who perpetrated this false oath and stole this person's money. And also the person, in the case where he did not have witnesses to what was done between them. And because of that, he created the possibility for all this to happen. He too has to confess. He also has a certain level of responsibility. He too has sinned here to a certain degree. And that's what Torah is alluding to here. Visvadu, they shall confess. The they is, of course, the perpetrator of the crime, and the person who actually created the potential, the environment for it to take place. And that is also a very, very fascinating concept to think about. There's no question that person bears responsibility for the wrong that he did. But we have a responsibility to others to make sure that we don't create the environment for that to happen. That is what the Torah is alluding to here when it says, they shall confess. The perpetrator of the crime has to confess, and the person who created the environment for that to happen has to confess. You should have had witnesses here. And because you didn't have witnesses, that's why this all happened, and therefore you bear responsibility. Very, very interesting concept of our responsibility one to another. Not to create an environment, not to create the potential for someone to do something wrong. Wish you all a good night. Thank you all for listening. Be well.